Hey everyone, I'm Mariana, and today I am finally showing you my top 10 books of 2017, none of which were actually published in 2017. As you probably already know, when it comes to these top 10 book videos, they very rarely have to do with the year of publication. They're just favorite reads of the past year, which is what this is. As I mentioned in my previous video, I read a total of 67 books in 2017, and if you want to see the full list of all of the books that I read, I will link my 2017 overview page from Goodreads in the info box below. I will also link my playlist of all of the wrap-ups that I did. Even though I did skip a few months last year, I still will link it if you want to learn more about some of the books that I mentioned today. And as always, everything I talk about will be linked in the info box below as well. I will have the list of the books, but I will have it in alphabetical order, so don't cheat and just look, because they will not be in the order of how I rank them. So starting this countdown at number 10 is Bird Box by Josh Malerman. And I did talk about this book a little bit in my top 5 fall reads. If you've seen that video, you probably remember me gushing about it a little bit there. This is such a wonderful thriller that I just can't recommend enough for anyone who is looking for a quick, engaging, fast-paced read. This is a dual timeline post-apocalyptic novel set in the world where seeing something outside drives people to go mad and kill everyone around them. Bird Box was just impossible to put down for me. I do believe I finished it in a day, maybe in 2 days, really quickly, and I do particularly recommend the audiobook. It is really good, not just because in combination with the premise, the audiobook experience makes a lot of sense, but also because the narrator is just really good as well. And now I'm very much looking forward to the Josh Malerman book that is coming out in 2018. At number 9, I have Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, and I am so sad that I never ended up doing a review for this, because I completely intended to, but I just never got around to doing it. And this is such an awesome sci-fi thriller, not hard sci-fi, more like physics type of sci-fi, and I think a lot of people would enjoy this book. Here, our lead character, Jason, is knocked unconscious one night only to wake up to a life he doesn't recognize, where the people he knows are not quite the same. While the writing style here isn't really anything exceptional or outstanding, it is exactly what it needs to be for this type of novel. It is very easy to get through, it's paced really well, and this is another one of those books that I read in a day or two. I actually read this for a readathon, and I would highly recommend this as a readathon book because you just fly through it. It is so much fun. At number 8, I have American Gods by Neil Gaiman. You guys know how much I love Neil Gaiman at this point, so if I've read any Neil Gaiman throughout the year, he's probably going to show up in my top 10 list because I adore his writing and his imagination, and this book is just something else. This complex novel tells a story of a man named Shadow Moon who, after he gets out of prison, finds himself employed by a mysterious Mr. Wednesday, and that puts him face to face with all kinds of gods he never knew actually existed. There is just so much packed into this: mythology, social commentary, lots of things to think about, adventure, weird stuff because we're dealing with Neil Gaiman, and of course his amazing writing style. The only thing I have to warn you about is that the pacing is quite slow, and I would definitely not recommend starting your Neil Gaiman journey with American Gods. I think it can be very overwhelming, and because there are so many different storylines, which I loved because I knew he was going to take this somewhere and it was all going to come together and make sense, but because there's so many storylines, it is easy to get lost in something like that and all of the information and everything going on. I just don't think this is a very good starting point for Neil Gaiman. But if you are already a Neil Gaiman fan and somehow you have not read American Gods, yes, check this out. This is amazing. I loved it, and this is definitely a book that I would love to revisit at some point. At number 7, I have A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and I am probably one of the last people to read this. Definitely one of the last people to read this out of people who talk about books on the internet, but I am so glad I finally got to this heartbreaking story. It is beautiful, it is wonderful, and it is worth all of the hype. This was actually the second book that I read in 2017, and it has stayed with me to this day. Another book that I would love to revisit at some point. This is a beautifully written and illustrated book about a boy who is repeatedly visited by a monster at night, and the monster seems to be set on teaching him a few life lessons through stories. I love it when an author can use an allegory well, and this is definitely a great example of that. On top of the writing being beautiful and dark and emotional, the actual message of this book and what the monster represents is just so powerful and so well done. I cannot recommend this enough. If you're like me and you've been waiting this whole time to read this, don't put it off any longer. At number 6, I actually have the last book that I read in 2017, and that is The Vegetarian by Han Kang. And this book just made an incredible impression on me. I cannot stop thinking about this. I am still randomly thinking about what this book had to say because it's not something you're going to forget. This South Korean novel tells a story of a young woman who suddenly decides to become a vegetarian and how this affects her life and the lives of people close to her, never approaching it from her perspective. Now, as you can see, I do have the Russian edition of the book, and that has to do with what I've learned about the English translation. You can Google it for yourself. I'm not going to talk too much about it. I will talk a little bit more about it in my top 5 books of this winter, which I completely expect this to be in that video. But basically, the English translation is not a bad translation, it's just not a very accurate translation. Because of this, I decided to go with the Russian translation, which is supposed to be much closer to the style and tone of the original text, and I have to say, after comparing the first few pages of the English and the Russian, they feel very different. However, regardless of the language that you read this in, this book is going to give you so much to think about and so many things to consider. It is just filled with meaning and ideas. Don't be turned off by the title if you think this is going to be preachy because it's called The Vegetarian. Being vegetarian is more of a catalyst for other things. It's not really about that at all. And I, like I said, absolutely loved it. I don't think this is going to be a book for everyone, but I do think this is a book everyone should attempt to read and understand. At number 5, I have Salem's Lot by Stephen King. This is another one of those books that you may recognize from my favorite books I read this fall video, and of course it was going to make an appearance on this list. It is an excellent vampire novel. If you're into classic scary vampires terrorizing a small town, Salem's Lot is for you. King is not here to feed your romantic fantasies, he's here to fuel your nightmares. As much as I struggled with it earlier this year, this book was a completely different experience for me. This was the perfect thing to read in the fall. The atmosphere was just right, and I did mention in my other video, but I'll say it again, this is now officially my second favorite Stephen King novel. I loved pretty much everything about this book. It has that perfect balance of storytelling, character development, atmosphere, and descriptions. It wasn't overly descriptive like some Stephen King books can be. It was just excellent, and I loved the way everything wrapped up in the end. Basically, highly recommend this one if you haven't read it yet. At number 4, I have The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This was my first experience with Cormac McCarthy's writing, and it was definitely a powerful one. This brilliantly written novel chronicles a journey of a father and his son across a very bleak post-apocalyptic landscape, and begs the question of what stops people from giving up. This is easily one of the best, but also one of the darkest portrayals of a dystopian future. And people who say that this book was just too dark and too depressing, I completely understand if you don't want to get into something like this. I personally loved it. It was very powerful. It was something that made me consider certain situations and think, what would I do in this situation? Which is always a good thing. So obviously I would recommend this just like I would with everything else on this list. And I'm very much looking forward to reading more Cormac McCarthy. I know the rest of his work is not dystopian. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the writing style and I can get along very well. At number 3, I have The First 15 Lives of Harry August by Claire North. This book was probably one of the biggest surprises for me in 2017. I didn't really have expectations for this, and it took me quite a while to actually read this. I've had this book pretty much since it came out, and this is how long it took me to actually pick it up, because I didn't think I would love it as much as I ended up loving it. The story is about a man who every time after he dies is born again under the same circumstances, bound to repeat his life to some extent until he gets a message that changes everything. This was such a captivating story, and despite the fact that you do go through his life a bunch of times, which sounds like it could get repetitive and kind of boring, it is never boring, and it is always fascinating. And I also really enjoyed the protagonist-antagonist dynamic. It was a pretty interesting villain, and a villain I could understand, which is always a great thing. Once again, a book that is fast-paced and difficult to put down. So if you haven't read this, give this one a try if you're looking for something that you're just going to fly through. At number 2, I have Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, and this is actually a book I read the same month when I read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, so that was some reading month. But this is just... it's weird to say that I loved this book, because the premise is just so disturbing and just, no, it's just so wrong, but the writing is just fascinating. It is fantastic. Everyone has to read this, even if you are just completely turned off by this premise. I am sure you've heard of this famously controversial and repeatedly banned novel that centers around a middle-aged man who is disturbingly and inappropriately obsessed with a 12-year-old girl. The thing about this novel is that the author never makes you feel like he is romanticizing the situation. It never feels like you should feel bad for the protagonist. You know that this is very, very wrong. It is more about the psychological aspect and getting into the mindset of this really messed up person, which was very, very interesting. And the way Nabokov uses the language is just out of this world. I cannot rave enough about the writing style and the mastery with which this is written. I cannot wait to read more of his works. And finally, at number 1, an author whom I have already mentioned on this list because Neil Gaiman is back. This is The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I can't remember the last time I finished a book, was really sad about how short it was, and wanted to immediately start it over. But that was the case with The Ocean at the End of the Lane. This novel is a very unique trip down memory lane for a man who returns to his hometown for a funeral. Here, Neil Gaiman tackles childhood, perception, and growing up in a perfect, melancholic, and honest way. Now, I am not going to once again gush about Neil Gaiman's imagination and writing style, because I have said this over and over again, not just in this video, but in other videos where I've talked about Neil Gaiman. But I do have to say that this is currently my favorite book from Neil Gaiman, and that is saying a lot because I pretty much love everything he writes. And if he ever stops writing, I'm going to be so sad. This novel is kind of difficult for me to describe because it is so short. I don't want to spoil anything. I went into this knowing absolutely nothing about it, and it was a magical realism journey from beginning to end that sadly ended way too soon, but at the same time was just perfect, absolutely perfect. I think another reason why I loved this book so much is because it's just something that I read at the right time in my life. And I'm sure you have all had an experience like that when a work of fiction or a film just came to you at the right moment and it just tugged at your heartstrings and it hit the right spot. And that's what this was for me. And what's interesting is that it is completely opposite in the style of storytelling to American Gods, and yet I love both of these books. This is actually something I would recommend as a starting point for Neil Gaiman. It is short and it is a very good illustration of his mind and how twisted and whimsical his stories get. I'm going to stop gushing about this. We can all tell this is an amazing book in my mind. All right, guys, that's it for my top 10 books that I read in 2017. Of course, I would love to know what your favorite books of 2017 were, and if you made a video about your favorites of the year, definitely link it in the comments below. I will make sure it gets past the spam filter because that's where most of the links get stuck. But I would love to know what your favorite reads were, and maybe I'll find something for myself to read for 2018. There were some books that I really wanted to include on this list, but I keep those to top 10 because if I start getting to honorable mentions, then I might as well just make a top 15, and then I feel like it's just too many favorites. But yes, there were a few more books that I really wish I could have included on this list, and there were some series that I read that I really enjoyed, but the top 10 is the top 10, and I'm sure if you've been watching my videos and following me on Goodreads, you know what those other books and series are. If you're not following me on Goodreads, then you definitely should be. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I hope you're having an amazing day, and I will see you with my top 10 films of 2017 very soon. Bye!